There is a Greek term called menace, which is in the first line of the Iliad when it says, of the menace of Achilles, which is kind of generally translated into of the wrath of Achilles. This is not a typical sort of everyday anger, but a something which invokes a cosmological boundary of which is transgressed or perhaps sometimes enforced. This is the general concept which comes from the book The Anger of Achilles by Leonard Molnár. It attempts to understand the kind of anger of Achilles within the Iliad as a reference to the larger context of Greek mythology and Greek cosmology. Within these stories, we understand how Zeus came to be the king of all gods, how he became the ultimate sovereign. This story is reflected within the emotion of menace, within the anger and the shame. There's a duality to this emotion. It's both anger and shame, depending on the context. Within this emotion, Zeus's sovereignty sort of asserts itself. Molnár writes, menace is not a word for a hostile emotion arising in one individual against some other individual, as we may spontaneously understand it. It is the name of a feeling not separate from the actions it entails, of cosmic sanction, of a social force whose activation brings drastic consequences on the whole community. Such actions which invoke menace could be something like stepping on a grave or refusing burial rites, or perhaps some sort of incest or some sort of heresy. There's certain taboos and prohibitions which are consequential not just for the individual who transgresses them, but for the whole community, or maybe even the whole world, we could argue. Now, to understand how the Iliad is a reflection of what already occurred within the kind of cosmological mythology of Greek mythology, we have to understand how Zeus became the sovereign. Zeus's grandfather was originally the sort of creator origin god, and then Zeus's father killed his grandfather in a pretty brutal way. And this destructive act was also a sort of act of creation, which created the world, much of the world as we know it. And then Zeus rebelled against his father, but he had to rebel against his father in a way in which wouldn't lead to the same fate of being surpassed or overthrown. So Zeus is an expression of sovereignty, but he's also an expression of trickery. He's trying to trick the world into escaping what his father did to his grandfather and what he did to his father, which was a sort of rebellion and a overthrow. Zeus did this, according to Molnár, by subverting the kind of pattern of creation that had come before. The rebellion of Zeus's father against his grandfather and of Zeus against his own father was done by a sort of conspiracy between him and the mother. So when Zeus was creating his own divine children, he wanted to create in a way in which he wouldn't create a male heir which would overthrow him. So, for example, he gave birth to Athena through his forehead, which is kind of weird. Athena being a female god who couldn't herself procreate, he sort of averts this pattern. He creates male heirs, but indirectly. So, for example, Achilles is his mother is a demigod, but his father is immortal. So Zeus kind of arranges these marriages, we could say. There's other stories of forcing female gods to sleep with male mortals in order to sort of create male heirs without them being a direct threat to the sovereignty of Zeus. So male human heroes are sort of a product of Zeus's attempt to create something divine, something glorious, without it being a threat to his godlike sovereignty. Within the Iliad, we see many descriptions of these heroes trying to transgress certain boundaries, certain kind of cosmological boundaries. Quoting Molnar, the parallelism in diction and theme between Diomedes and Ares is not isolated or a chance. Diomedes being one of the heroes of the Iliad, and Ares being god of war. It is not an isolated chance or phenomena. It is a token of the ritual antagonism between hero and god. That is a constitutive principle of Diomedes' aristei, and aristei is a Greek word meaning the kind of highest point of a warrior, the kind of moment in which the warrior becomes reaches the highest potential, or displays the highest point of excellence. Molnar continues and says, quote, "The antagonism cannot exist without a relationship of identity between hero and god on some fundamental level. Antagonism and, paradoxically, heroic glory itself arise when the hero tries to reach and surpass the god with whom he identifies and against whom he struggles." So there's a kind of duality of within that relationship. There's a intense identification, a sort of impassioned identification with the god, in which elevates and inspires the hero, but at the same time there's a point of which he struggles against. It's not a completely positive identification. There's also a kind of punishment, or a kind of punitive pushback for getting too close, for flying too close to the sun, we could say. Molnar continues, "To return from this digression to the variant menace theme of Book 5, it too is part of the Diomedes Ares identification / antagonism. But as Ares is restrained from fighting by Athena's threat that he will incur the menace of Zeus, so Diomedes is restrained from fighting on the grounds that he will incur the menace of Apollo." So you see a kind of reflexive dynamic between gods, Zeus being the all-powerful god. The other gods fear transgressing his commands on account of incurring his menace. It's not simply between mortals and gods, or between kind of hierarchies and dynamics within the realm of gods themselves, which we see menace. We also see menace on a more kind of sociological basis for how we can understand the dynamics between different people within the Greek community of heroes. And in particular, the contention between Achilles and Agamemnon is probably most relevant. Many will know that in the Iliad, Agamemnon takes Briseis from Achilles. Briseis is a girl which Achilles took from a city that they sacked on the way to Troy, and she sort of becomes a symbol of something which reflects not just Achilles' value in the sense of him just having a sort of like egotistical, self-aggrandizing view of himself or something, but she becomes something which reflects how the Greek community relates to Achilles. So when she's taken from him, it upsets what we could call a very kind of complicated and fragile dynamic, which unifies the Greeks, because of course the Greeks are not unified for the same reasons as the Trojans are. The Trojans are unified simply by the fact that they're being attacked by the Greeks. The Greeks aren't unified in that same way. They're all from different cities and they're brought together in order to kind of pursue this one task, but it's not a kind of urgent, there isn't the same urgency to defend themselves against a invading force. The motivational principles to get them to all kind of act cohesively are much more fragile. And Achilles, being the greatest of the Greek warriors, is obviously constantly sort of kind of just by the fact of what he is undermining the authority of Agamemnon, who's trying to, let's say, constantly interfere with and deprive Achilles of the symbolic reflections of how much the Greeks need him and how much the Greeks should be valuing him. And as we said before, menace reflects sorts of transgressions and prohibitions which aren't just consequential to the single person that's breaking some sort of transgression, or that is transgressing across some sort of prohibition. It's something which affects the whole community, and we see this with the fact that Agamemnon is kind of depriving Achilles of that which reflects his social value. He then gets alienated, stays by the ships, refuses to participate in kind of to spite Agamemnon, and then because of his lack of participation, Hector nearly destroys all the Greeks and slaughters all the Greeks, until of course Patroclus is killed, and then Achilles is dragged back into the fold, and then of course kills Hector, and so on and so forth. So both the Greeks and the Trojans are sort of their fate is determined by what happens with Achilles, whether he participates or not. And so Achilles' menace, his wrath, is the determining force for the entire war. And the way in which this wrath, this kind of superhuman wrath, is managed and responded to determines whether or not we all go home alive. Basically, it's the most consequential force. Our sort of emotional awareness of this phenomena is hugely important, because everything is at stake from it. So this perfectly reflects the sort of cosmological grandiosity of this kind of phenomena. There's something to be learned here about kind of human psychology and human ontology, which is far more important than just sort of like nerdy literary interpretations and literary analysis. The hero, right, in the ancient Greek sense, is someone who can withstand menace. So, for example, Achilles is able to kill Hector and then drag his body around and desecrate his body, which is transgressing and offending the burial rituals and burial rites, which of course invoke in us today. I mean, if we were to see someone dragging a dead body around, we would be horrified. This is something which has lasted all the way into modernity. This isn't just something a kind of peculiar convention of ancient cult of warriors or something. This is something which is kind of an eternal, primordial taboo for human beings. Achilles can transgress these prohibitions, but no matter how glorious the hero, they're never totally free from the menace of the gods. Of course, in the end, Achilles is eventually, well, not in the Iliad, but in the larger mythological framework, he is eventually killed. You could say that the hero, the heroic kind of type, their 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 goal is to move towards these boundaries, these cosmologically prohibited boundaries, to move towards them, and they're never able to totally surpass them, because of course, like, Zeus is the sovereign, there's no surpassing him, but they're able to sort of move towards these borders and sort of expose themselves to these borders and challenge them and invoke the menace of the gods, um, in a way which I suppose expresses this impassioned and heightened identification with divinity. But it's never an identification which goes without sacrifice. It's always an identification which, even though it elevates, it always pushes back and it always punishes. So the sort of heroic life, we could say, is that which explores these borders and investigates them, but also exposes oneself and acknowledges the inevitability and the danger of that eventual pushback.